At 8:47 a.m. on December 14th, Prince William initiated a telephone call that palace insiders later characterized as the most grueling conversation of his entire life. The exchange spanned merely 11 minutes, yet by its conclusion, the trajectory of the monarchy had pivoted in ways nobody could have predicted. The catalyst for that conversation was a cache of files unsealed only hours prior. Documents exposing a truth the institution had suppressed for more than 30 years. The morning began in silence, lacking the cozy tranquility of a winter Saturday, and instead carrying the heavy, anticipatory stillness that descends upon London when major news is about to break. At the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, a solitary judge arrived before daybreak, flanked by court officials who fully grasped the magnitude of the event unfolding. The courtroom, typically teeming with barristers and onlookers, remained vacant, save for a select few palace representatives and legal observers granted entry under rigorous confidentiality protocols. At exactly 6:02 a.m., Justice Margaret Thornhill stepped into her chambers and executed the order that would alter everything. The sealed documents, held under classified status since 1996, were released to the public record with immediate effect. These files contained correspondence, financial settlements, and legal negotiations between Princess Diana and the royal household during the waning months of her marriage to Prince Charles. They had been sealed by court mandate during the divorce proceedings, shielded by privacy laws intended to protect both the institution and Diana's memory from gratuitous exposure. Within minutes of the signature, alerts reached Buckingham Palace, where a senior legal advisor, already awake and tracking the situation, immediately contacted Kensington Palace. The call reached Prince William's private secretary at 6:15 a.m., with a message that was concise yet urgent. The Diana files have been unsealed, and His Royal Highness needs to be briefed immediately. William was already up, seated in his private study, nursing a cup of tea while scanning briefing notes for his scheduled appearances when his secretary knocked and stepped inside. The look on the aide's face conveyed everything William needed to know before a single syllable was uttered. "The files?" William asked softly, to which his secretary nodded and replied, "Released this morning. The court published them electronically, and media outlets will have access within the hour." William set down his tea, his hands remaining steady despite the sudden constriction tightening in his chest. He had known this moment was inevitable, as the legal battle over the archives had raged for nearly 2 years, and palace lawyers had repeatedly cautioned him that the verdict was precarious. However, understanding a probability intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two profoundly different realities. "Send me everything," William commanded, "because I want to view the full contents before anyone else does." By 6:45 a.m., the digital files had been securely transmitted to Kensington Palace. William sat alone in his study as the documents populated his screen, revealing page after page of legal correspondence, financial settlement drafts, and formal agreements bearing both Diana's signature and the palace's official seal. The first detail that arrested his attention was his mother's handwriting. He had seen it before, naturally, in letters she wrote to him during his childhood, in birthday cards, and in notes tucked into his school trunk. Yet seeing it here, scribbled in the margins of legal paperwork, annotated with questions, concerns, and occasional flashes of frustration, felt like encountering her ghost in a space he never anticipated. The second detail that struck him was the sheer complexity of the material. These were not the records of a woman being silenced or coerced. They were the records of someone negotiating, strategizing, and battling for specific outcomes that were vital to her. As William delved deeper, one distinct theme surfaced repeatedly. Diana had been fiercely protecting her sons. Across the metropolis, Journalists were starting to receive identical data packets. Newsrooms at the BBC, The Times, The Guardian, and every major outlet scrambled to deploy reporters, historians, and legal analysts to dissect the contents. Within 30 minutes, the first headlines began materializing online. Sealed Diana documents finally public. Diana's financial settlement revealed. And, after decades, what the palace didn't want you to know about Diana's divorce. The tone of the initial coverage was cautious, almost hesitant, as editors realized they were handling something fragile that impacted not just history, but living individuals. However, as the morning progressed and more details surfaced, the narrative began to calcify. Diana had signed agreements limiting her ability to speak publicly about the royal family. She had accepted financial terms that, while substantial, came attached with stringent conditions. She had accomplished all of this while navigating a system that possessed significantly more power than she did. In New York, where it was just past 1 in the morning, CNN interrupted its regular programming with a breaking news banner. Sealed Diana, files released. Content shocking. American morning shows, already prepping for their weekend broadcasts, began overhauling their entire rundowns to pivot toward the story. For American audiences, particularly those old enough to recall Diana's death in 1997, the unsealing felt like tearing open a wound that had never completely healed. William understood this implicitly. By 7:30 a.m., he had read enough to realize he faced a dilemma that no amount of royal training had equipped him to handle. The documents, dense with legal jargon and structured in the formal style of 1990s court filings, narrated a story William had never fully comprehended. He had been 14 years old when his parents' divorce was finalized in August 1996, old enough to sense that something painful was transpiring, but too young to grasp the mechanics of what his mother was navigating behind closed doors. The earliest document in the collection bore the date March 1993, written mere months after the official declaration of Charles and Diana's separation. It was a letter from Diana to her attorney, handwritten on Kensington Palace stationery, outlining her priorities as divorce negotiations commenced. The letter was striking in its clarity and singular focus. "I need 3 things protected," Diana had written in her neat, flowing script. "My ability to remain involved in my sons' lives, their financial security independent of whatever happens to me, and my freedom to continue the work I believe matters." William read the letter twice, his throat tightening with emotion. He had never doubted his mother's love or her commitment to him and Harry. However, seeing it articulated so plainly at a time when her own life was unraveling hit him with unexpected force. What surprised William most were Diana's counter-proposals, documented in a series of letters between her legal team and the palace. She had pushed back, not on the financial terms, but on the restrictions placed upon her. In one particularly pointed letter dated November 1994, Diana's solicitor had written to the palace's legal representative, arguing that the proposed confidentiality clauses were too sweeping and would prevent the princess from defending herself should future controversies arise. The palace's response, drafted by a senior lawyer whose name William recognized, was firm but not malicious. "The institution's position is that mutual discretion serves both parties. We are prepared to increase the financial settlement to $18.5 million and guarantee continued security provisions, but the confidentiality terms are non-negotiable." William could visualize the negotiation unfolding across the pages. Diana, advised by her legal team, had made a calculated decision to accept the confidentiality restrictions in exchange for 2 specific guarantees. First, that William and Harry would retain their places in the line of succession without any ambiguity or challenge. Second, that their financial inheritances from both the Spencer family and the royal family would be protected through trust structures that could not be altered without their consent once they reached adulthood. A memo from Diana's financial advisor dated January 1996 spelled it out plainly. The princess has prioritized her son's long-term security over her own immediate freedom. She believes, and I concur, that accepting these terms now will prevent future disputes that could harm the young prince's positions within the institution. William reclined in his chair, fixing his gaze on the study's ceiling. His mother had traded pieces of her own autonomy to protect him and Harry. She had accepted restrictions on her voice, her story, and her ability to defend herself publicly because she believed it would secure their futures. Yet the files contained something else, something that twisted the narrative in a way William had not anticipated. Interspersed among the legal documents were handwritten notes, fragments of Diana's internal dialogue as she processed what she was agreeing to. One note, undated but clearly written during the negotiation period, reads simply, "I hope they understand someday why I chose this." Another note, scrawled in the margin of a financial agreement draft, stated, "Not about the money, never about the money. It's about making sure they have choices I didn't." William felt something fracture inside him, not anger or resentment, but a profound sadness that his mother had carried this burden in isolation. She had made these choices knowing her sons were too young to understand, hoping that someday, somehow, they would. The typed portion confirmed her acceptance of the final terms, while the handwritten postscript added in blue ink read, "I've done what I can. The rest is up to them. Please ensure these files are sealed, and if they're ever opened, I want my boys to see that I tried." William's vision blurred as he set the document down and pressed his palms against his eyes, attempting to hold himself together. Outside his study window, the December morning was gray and cold, the kind of day that felt as if it might never fully brighten. He heard a soft knock, and Catherine entered quietly, carrying a fresh cup of tea. She set it down on his desk without a word, then saw the expression on his face, and understood immediately. "You've read them," she said gently. William nodded, unable to speak, as Catherine pulled a chair beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Whatever is in those files," she said quietly, "your mother loved you, and that was never in question." William finally found his voice, though it emerged raw and strained. "She gave up so much to protect us, and I never knew." Catherine squeezed his hand and replied, "Now you do, and that knowledge, painful as it is, means something." William nodded slowly, but the knowledge also brought a terrible new burden. In less than 2 hours, the rest of the world would begin forming their own interpretations of these files. Unless someone who understood the full context spoke up, the narrative would be written by people who had never known Diana, never loved her, and never carried the weight of what she had sacrificed. By 7:50 a.m., the media coverage had intensified significantly. The BBC had assembled a panel of royal historians, legal experts, and Diana biographers to discuss the unsealed files. Sky News was running a continuous live feed with breaking analysis, and across social media, the documents were being dissected line by line, with interpretations ranging from sympathetic to cynical. The dominant narrative emerging, particularly in British outlets, was one of complexity. Diana had not been powerless, but neither had she been free. She had negotiated within a system designed to protect itself, and she had made choices that reflected both strength and constraint. However, American coverage was taking a decidedly different tone. Morning shows on CBS and NBC were framing the story as confirmation of what Diana's supporters had long claimed, that the institution had silenced her. They argued that money had been used to buy her compliance, and that her death in 1997 had prevented her from ever telling her full story. William watched a segment from Good Morning America on his tablet, his jaw tightening as the host spoke with barely concealed outrage. These documents prove what we've suspected for decades. Diana was trapped in a system that valued its reputation over her well-being. And now, nearly 30 years later, we're finally seeing the evidence. Catherine, standing beside him, frowned and said, "They're not reading it correctly. They're seeing what they want to see." William nodded grimly and replied, "And Harry will too." That was the crux of the problem. Harry, living in California and still deeply estranged from the institution, would inevitably interpret these files through the lens of his own grievances. He would see the confidentiality clauses as proof of oppression. He would see the financial settlement as hush money. He would use these documents to validate every accusation he had made about the family over the past 5 years, unless someone stopped him. Unless someone explained the full context, in Diana's own words, before the narrative solidified. The damage would be catastrophic. William's phone buzzed with a message from Princess Anne. "Have you seen the coverage?" William typed back quickly. "Yes." Anne's response came seconds later. "You need to control this before it spirals." William stared at the message, understanding exactly what she meant. The institution would not issue a statement, as King Charles could not emotionally or politically do so. It would look defensive, self-serving, and would only inflame the situation. But William, as Diana's son, and as someone who had lived through the divorce and its aftermath, possessed a unique authority. If anyone could speak to the complexity of what Diana had done, it was him. But speak to whom? A formal statement would be parsed and criticized. A television interview would be dissected for weeks. And any public comment risked appearing to defend the institution at his mother's expense, something William would never do. Catherine watched him process the dilemma and saw the conflict written across his face. "There's only one person who needs to hear this from you," she said quietly. William looked at her, and she held his gaze steadily. "Harry," she continued, "before he reads these files through the filter of everything else, he needs to hear from you what they actually say." William's first instinct was resistance, as he and Harry had barely spoken in months. Their last conversation, strained and brief, had ended in mutual frustration. Calling now, in the middle of this crisis, would reopen wounds that had barely begun to scar. But Catherine was right. If Harry weaponized these files without understanding their full context, the damage would be irreversible, not just to the institution, but to Diana's legacy. Because the files, read carefully, did not show a woman defeated. They showed a woman making impossible choices with limited power, trying to protect her children in the only ways available to her. Princess Anne's words echoed in William's mind, something she had said to him years ago during another family crisis. "The institution survived because your mother understood duty. She understood sacrifice, and she chose to protect what mattered most." William had never fully grasped what Anne meant until now. Diana had not been crushed by the institution. She had negotiated with it, accepted its terms when necessary, and extracted protections for her sons that had held firm for nearly 3 decades. But explaining that to Harry, who had spent years building a narrative of institutional cruelty, would require more than facts. It would require empathy, patience, and a willingness to be vulnerable in a way William rarely allowed himself. He looked at Catherine, who was watching him with that quiet strength he had relied on for over a decade. "What if he doesn't listen?" William asked. Catherine's response was simple. "Then at least you tried, and that matters." William stood, walking to the window. Outside, the December morning had brightened slightly. though the sky remained heavy with clouds. Somewhere across an ocean, his brother was waking up to the same news, surrounded by people who would tell him exactly what he wanted to hear. They would tell him that he had been right all along, that the institution was irredeemable, and that their mother had been a victim. Unless William reached him first, that narrative would win. He turned back to Catherine and said, "I need the files, all of them, especially the letters where she talks about protecting us." Catherine nodded and handed him the tablet where the documents were stored. William scrolled through, marking specific pages, specific paragraphs, and specific handwritten notes that told the story he needed Harry to understand. At 8:35 a.m., he returned to his desk, his phone sitting in front of him, the screen dark. He knew Harry's number by heart, though he had not dialed it in months. Princess Anne sent another message. "The clock is ticking." William picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. This call would be difficult, perhaps the most difficult of his life, but it was also necessary. Because if there was even a chance that Harry might listen, that he might see their mother's choices through a lens of love rather than oppression, then William had to try. He had to try because Diana had tried. She had made sacrifices, accepted constraints, and carried burdens she never complained about, all to protect her sons. The least William could do was honor that by telling the truth. At 8:47 a.m., he pressed the call button. The phone rang once. Twice, William could feel his heartbeat in his chest, steady but insistent. Part of him hoped Harry wouldn't answer, that he could leave a voicemail and fulfill his obligation without the confrontation. But another part, the part that still remembered when they were brothers first and princes second, hoped desperately that Harry would pick up. On the fourth ring, the line connected. There was a pause, long enough that William wondered if Harry had answered by accident. Then his brother's voice came through, cautious and cool. "William," he said, not hostile, but not warm either, using the tone of someone who had learned to guard himself, who had been hurt too many times to drop his defenses easily. "Harry," William replied, his own voice carefully neutral. "I need to talk to you about the files." Another pause ensued before Harry replied. "I've seen the headlines." "Have you read them?" William asked. "The actual documents?" "I will," Harry said, his voice carrying an edge now. "I'm sure they'll confirm everything I've already said." William closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. "That's why I'm calling," William said, "because if you read them without context, you'll miss what she was actually doing." He could hear movement on Harry's end, the rustle of fabric, maybe Harry standing or pacing. The sound of a California morning felt so different from the London winter outside William's window. "What was she actually doing?" Harry asked, his voice shifting not quite to anger, but moving toward it. "You mean accepting hush money from the institution that destroyed her?" William felt a flash of frustration but forced it down. "That's exactly the interpretation I'm trying to prevent, because it's not accurate, and you'll see that if you let me explain." Silence fell again, and William could almost see his brother's face, the way his jaw would set when he was deciding whether to engage or withdraw. They had been on opposite sides of this pattern for years now, Harry expecting betrayal, William trying to bridge a gap that seemed to widen no matter what he did. Finally, Harry spoke. 5 minutes, you have 5 minutes." William glanced at the clock. It was 8:49 a.m. "The files show Mom negotiating," William began, choosing his words carefully. Not surrendering, not being silenced, but negotiating for specific things she wanted protected. "Of course they frame it that way," Harry interrupted. "That's what the palace does. They rewrite history to make themselves look reasonable. I'm reading her words, Harry, William said, keeping his voice steady. Her handwriting, notes she made in the margins, letters she wrote to her solicitor. This isn't palace spin. This is her explaining her own choices. He heard Harry exhale, a sound somewhere between skepticism and reluctant curiosity. What choices? Harry asked. William pulled up one of the documents on his screen. In March 1993, she wrote to her solicitor listing her priorities, William read. 3 things: her involvement in our lives, our financial security independent of whatever happened to her, and her freedom to continue her work. Those were her words, her priorities. And they bought her off on all 3, Harry countered. No, William corrected him. They negotiated, William insisted. She accepted restrictions on herself, restrictions on speaking publicly about the family, in exchange for guarantees about us, about our positions, our inheritances, our futures. He heard the shift in Harry's breathing, a subtle change that suggested he was listening more carefully now. William continued, There's a memo from her financial advisor in January 1996. It says, and I'm quoting, "The princess has prioritized her son's long-term security over her own immediate freedom." That doesn't make it right, Harry said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. William pressed forward. There's more, he said. She wrote a note. We don't know exactly when, but it was during the negotiations. It says, not about the money, never about the money. It's about making sure they have choices I didn't. The silence that followed was different, heavier, the kind of silence that arrives when something lands in a way that cannot be easily deflected. William waited, letting his brother process. He knew Harry well enough to understand that pushing too hard would trigger resistance, but giving him space might allow the truth to settle. Why are you telling me this? Harry finally asked, and for the first time in the conversation his voice sounded less guarded and more genuinely confused. Because the media is going to frame this as proof she was victimized, William said. And you're going to be tempted to use it that way, to say it validates everything you've claimed about the institution. Harry's response came quickly. It does validate it. William shook his head, even though Harry couldn't see him. It validates that the system was flawed, that she had limited power, that she made choices under constraint, William admitted. But it also shows she made those choices strategically to protect us. And if you reduce that to a simple story of oppression, you erase her agency. That hit something. William could hear it in the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. She wasn't just a victim, William continued, his voice softer now. She was smarter than that. She understood the game better than anyone, and she played it the only way she could to give us what she never had. Freedom, security, choices. Harry did not respond immediately. William imagined him standing in that Montecito house, probably in his own study or on a terrace overlooking the California hills, surrounded by a life he had built by walking away from everything Diana had negotiated to protect. There's a letter, William said quietly, one of the last documents. She wrote it to her solicitor just before the divorce was finalized. She accepted the terms, and then she added a handwritten note. He paused, reading it from his screen. I've done what I can. The rest is up to them. Please ensure these files are sealed, and if they're ever opened, I want my boys to see that I tried. The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. William didn't break it. He let Diana's words sit between them, letting them carry the weight she had intended. When Harry finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, almost fragile. She wanted us to see this? William's throat tightened as he replied, She wanted us to understand that everything she did, even the things that looked like giving in, she did for us. Harry didn't respond with words, but William heard something that might have been a sharp breath, the kind someone takes when they're trying not to cry. "I didn't know," Harry said finally. "Neither did I," William admitted. "Not until this morning." For a moment, they existed in shared grief rather than opposition. They were two men in their 40s, both still trying to understand a mother they lost too soon, both carrying wounds from a childhood neither had chosen. "William," Harry said, his voice steadier now, "I can't just forget everything that's happened between us, between me and the family." "I'm not asking you to," William replied. "I'm asking you to read these files carefully, to see what she actually did, and to honor that by not weaponizing her choices in a way that distorts them." Another pause followed. Then Harry said something William hadn't expected. "Send them to me," Harry requested. "The letters, the notes. I want to read them myself." William felt something loosen in his chest. "I'll have them sent within the hour." "And William," Harry's voice carried a note William hadn't heard in years, something tentative, almost vulnerable. "Thank you for calling." William nodded, even though Harry couldn't see. "You're my brother," William said simply. The line went quiet again, not awkwardly this time, but weighted with everything they couldn't quite say. They had not reconciled, and they had not resolved their differences. But for 11 minutes, they had been sons together, united in trying to understand a mother whose love had shaped both their lives in ways they were only now beginning to fully grasp. When the call ended at 8:58 a.m., William sat in silence, staring at his phone. He didn't know if anything had truly changed. He didn't know if Harry would honor what they had discussed, or if the old patterns would reassert themselves. But he had tried, and that, he thought, was what Diana would have wanted. The conversation had spanned exactly 11 minutes and 42 seconds, though in William's memory it would exist simply as the 11-minute call. It was a number that seemed to capture the weight of what had passed between them. After Harry hung up, William remained at his desk, the phone still in his hand, feeling the exhaustion that follows emotional intensity. Catherine had left him alone during the call, understanding that this was something he needed to do without an audience. She returned now, entering quietly and sitting in the chair across from him. "How did it go?" she asked. William set the phone down and replied, "Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped." Catherine waited, letting him find the words in his own time. "He listened," William continued. "He didn't agree with everything, and he didn't apologize for anything, but he listened, and he asked me to send him the documents, the letters, Mom's notes." Catherine's expression softened as she said, "That's significant." William nodded slowly. "I think he was genuinely surprised. He's built this narrative where Mom was purely a victim, where everything the institution did to her was cruel and controlling," William reflected. "The files do show that. They show how limited her options were, but they also show she wasn't helpless. She was strategic. She fought for what mattered to her, and Harry heard that." "I think he's willing to consider it," William concluded, "which is more than I expected." Outside, the December morning had fully arrived, though the sky remained gray and heavy. The media coverage would continue escalating throughout the day. By evening, every major outlet in Britain and America would run in-depth analyses of the unsealed files. Historians would debate Diana's choices, biographers would offer competing interpretations, and the public, divided as always on matters involving the royal family, would form opinions based on their existing sympathies. But for William, the media storm felt secondary now. What mattered was that he had reached his brother before the narrative hardened. He had reached him before Harry's advisors and supporters had coached him into a predetermined response. Whether it would make a lasting difference remained uncertain, but the door, at least, was not completely closed. Catherine stood, moving to the window, and said, "You know, he'll still be angry about other things, about the way he's been treated, about feeling excluded." William joined her at the window. "I know," he replied, "and I don't expect this to fix everything between us. But maybe for once," William said, "we can both see Mom clearly, not as a symbol for our own grievances, just as she was, complicated, constrained, but trying to protect us in the only ways she could." The palace machinery, meanwhile, had begun its own careful response. At 9:15 a.m., Buckingham Palace issued a brief statement, carefully worded to acknowledge the unsealing without offering detailed commentary. The royal household respects the court's decision to release these historical documents. The contents reflect a difficult period for all involved, handled with the dignity and discretion that characterized the late Princess of Wales. No further comment will be provided at this time. It was classic palace restraint, saying almost nothing while acknowledging just enough to avoid appearing defensive or dismissive. Senior advisors had debated longer statements and more detailed explanations, but ultimately concluded that silence was stronger. They decided to let the documents speak for themselves. Princess Anne, when informed of William's call with Harry, offered a response that was quintessentially her. "You did what needed doing," she said. "Don't expect gratitude, just understand you fulfilled your duty." It was harsh comfort, but comfort nonetheless. By late morning, the American media reaction had evolved. Several outlets that had initially framed the story as pure vindication of Diana's victimhood began publishing more nuanced analyses after actually reading the full documents. The New York Times ran a piece titled "Diana's Divorce: Agency Within Constraint," while the Washington Post published an opinion column arguing that Diana's negotiations showed strategic intelligence often overlooked in narratives that reduced her to a tragic figure. Not all American coverage shifted, of course. Some outlets, particularly those that had aligned themselves with Harry and Meghan's perspective over the past 5 years, maintained that the files proved institutional cruelty. But the dominant narrative, even in the United States, began acknowledging complexity. British reaction was predictably more measured from the start. The Times ran a lengthy historical analysis examining Diana's divorce in the context of previous royal separations. The Guardian published interviews with legal experts explaining the constraints Diana faced under both royal protocol and British family law in the 1990s. And The Telegraph, always protective of institutional continuity, emphasized Diana's own words about prioritizing her son's security. Back in California, Harry dedicated his morning to reading. William had sent the documents as promised, and Harry worked through them methodically, alone in his study. Meghan had offered to read with him, but he had declined. This felt like something he needed to process privately. A conversation with his mother across the gulf of nearly 3 decades. When he reached the handwritten notes, the margins where Diana had scribbled her thoughts and concerns, something inside him shifted. He had spent years carrying an image of his mother as powerless, destroyed by an institution that had never valued her. But these notes showed someone different. Someone who understood exactly what game she was playing, and who made calculated choices to protect what mattered most to her. Not about the money, never about the money. Harry stared at that line for a long time. His own departure from royal life had been framed by both media and critics as financially motivated. He had been accused of cashing in on his royal status, of trading his heritage for Netflix deals and memoir advances. And while he had always insisted his motivations were about freedom and protection for his family, the accusations had stung. But his mother, facing similar accusations in her time, had written those words, "Not about the money. It was about having choices." Harry didn't know what to do with that realization. It didn't erase his anger at how he and Meghan had been treated, and it didn't resolve his feelings about the institution or his fractured relationship with his family. But it complicated things in a way he hadn't anticipated. By early afternoon, the media coverage had largely stabilized. The initial shock had given way to analysis, and the sensational headlines had been replaced by more thoughtful examinations. While debates would continue for days, the fundamental narrative had been established. Diana had navigated an impossible situation with limited power but considerable intelligence, making choices that protected her sons even at personal cost. It was not the story of a saint or a martyr. It was the story of a mother doing the best she could with the options available to her. For William, sitting in his study as the December afternoon darkened, that felt like the truth. Imperfect, complicated, but true. His phone buzzed with a message from Harry, the first communication between them initiated by his brother in months. "I read them. I don't agree with everything, but I understand more than I did." William typed back carefully. "That's all I was hoping for." There was a pause, then another message from Harry. "She was stronger than either of us realized." William felt his eyes sting as he typed, "Yes, she was." The conversation ended there. There were no promises of reconciliation, no plans to speak again soon, just a moment of shared understanding between two brothers who had lost their mother too young and were still, decades later, trying to make sense of what she had left them. As evening settled over London, William stood at his window, watching lights flicker on across the city. Catherine came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his shoulder. "You did well today," she said quietly. William covered her hands with his and replied, "I did what she would have wanted. I tried to protect what she built." "And that," Catherine replied, "is exactly what a son should do." The exhaustion hit William fully around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a bone-deep weariness that came not from physical exertion, but from emotional expenditure. He had spent the day managing reactions, coordinating with palace communications, and processing revelations about his mother that had fundamentally shifted his understanding of his own childhood. Catherine found him in his study staring at a photograph he kept on the shelf behind his desk. It was from 1995, taken at Eton during a school event. Diana stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, both of them smiling. William was 14 in the photo, on the cusp of understanding far more than he wanted to about his family's fractures. Diana was 34, in the middle of negotiations that would determine the next chapter of her life and the security of her son's futures. Looking at that photograph now, knowing what he knew about what she had been carrying during that period, William felt a fresh wave of grief. It was not the sharp, immediate grief of loss, but the deeper, more complicated grief of understanding what had been sacrificed for him without his knowledge or consent. "She looks tired," Catherine said softly, standing beside him. William nodded and said, "She was fighting battles I never saw, making choices I was too young to understand, and carrying it all alone because she didn't want us to worry." Catherine took his hand and replied, "You carry a lot of her strength. The way you handled today, the call with Harry, that was her in you." William appreciated the sentiment, but he also understood something Catherine was too kind to say directly. The truth had cost him something today, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would show up in headlines or official statements, but in a quieter, more personal sense. For years, William had maintained a careful balance in how he thought about his mother's divorce and the institution's role in it. He acknowledged the palace had been imperfect, that the system had been rigid and sometimes cruel, but he had also defended the institution as fundamentally necessary, as something worth preserving, despite its flaws. That balance had allowed him to honor both his mother's memory and his duty to the crown. But reading her words today, seeing how constrained her choices had been, and understanding the price she had paid to secure his future, that balance felt harder to maintain. Because Diana had made sacrifices not just for abstract reasons or because she believed in duty, but specifically to protect him and Harry. She had accepted limitations on her own freedom so that her sons would have the security and choices she lacked. And William had spent his adult life defending the very system that had imposed those limitations. It wasn't that he regretted his choices. He still believed the monarchy served a purpose, and he still believed in modernizing rather than abandoning the institution. But today had revealed the cost of that belief in a way he couldn't unknow. The palace issued its final statement of the day at 5:30 p.m., confirming that no senior royals would be giving interviews or making further comments on the unsealed files. The decision, communicated through normal channels, was received without controversy. The public seemed to understand that this was a family matter, complicated by its historical significance, but fundamentally private in its pain. King Charles, who had spent the day in seclusion at Highgrove, called William in the early evening. The conversation was brief, strained by all the things neither of them could quite say. "You spoke with Harry," Charles said, "and it was not quite a question." "I did," William confirmed. "And he listened. I think he understands more of what she was trying to do." Charles was quiet for a long moment before saying, "She loved you both more than anything. Everything she did, even the things that seemed contradictory or confusing, came from that love." William heard the rawness in his father's voice, the guilt that Charles had carried for decades about his failed marriage and his role in Diana's unhappiness. "I know, Dad," William replied gently. "I understand that now." After they hung up, William sat in the growing darkness of his study, too tired to turn on lights. He thought about his mother, about the negotiations she had navigated, and about the notes she had written hoping her sons would someday understand. He thought about Harry alone in California, reading those same documents and wrestling with his own complicated feelings. And he thought about himself standing in the middle, trying to bridge gaps that seemed unbridgeable, trying to honor a mother's sacrifices while serving an institution that had constrained her. The media coverage would continue for days. Historians would debate the significance of the files for years, and the public would form opinions that reflected their own relationship to the monarchy. But for William, the truth had already settled into something more personal and more painful. His mother had protected him by limiting herself. She had secured his future by accepting constraints on her own. He would spend the rest of his life serving an institution that had asked that sacrifice of her. It was not a comfortable truth, nor was it simple, but it was the truth, revealed in his mother's own handwriting after nearly 3 decades of silence. Catherine found him still sitting in the dark an hour later. She turned on a small lamp, bathing the room in soft light, and sat beside him without speaking. After a long silence, William said, "I don't regret calling Harry, but I think it cost me something." Catherine waited for him to continue. "I can't defend the institution the same way anymore," he said. "Not blindly, not without acknowledging what it asked of her." "You've never defended it blindly," Catherine replied gently. "You've always pushed for change, for modernization." William shook his head and said, "But I've also insisted it was fundamentally good." that the problems were fixable. Today, I saw how much it can take from someone even when they're trying to work within it, even when they're following the rules. Catherine took his hand and said, "Then you work harder to make sure it doesn't take that much from anyone else. You honor what she sacrificed by making the institution worthy of that sacrifice." William looked at her, this woman who had chosen to marry into the same system that had broken Diana, who had navigated its constraints with grace and intelligence. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you accept what it demands without resenting it?" Catherine smiled sadly and replied, "I resent it sometimes, but I also remember why I chose it. Not for the institution, but for you, for our children, for the possibility that we might make it better." William pulled her close, holding her in a way that felt less like comfort and more like anchoring. Outside, London continued its Saturday evening rhythms, oblivious to the quiet crisis being resolved in a study at Kensington Palace. The unsealed files would remain public record. Diana's words would be analyzed and debated, and somewhere in California, Harry would continue processing what he had learned. He would carry his own complicated relationship with their mother's choices, because that, in the end, was what Diana had given him. Not just security or position or privilege, but the understanding that sometimes love requires sacrifice, that protection has a price, and that the weight of inheritance includes not just what you receive, but what you owe to those who made it possible. The photograph on his desk, Diana's hand on his 14-year-old shoulder, seemed to glow in the lamplight. William looked at it for a long time, then finally whispered words only Catherine heard. "I understand now, Mom, and I'll try to make it worth what you gave." In the silence that followed, Catherine squeezed his hand, and somewhere in the archives of history, sealed and then unsealed, Diana's own words echoed across the years. "I've done what I can. The rest is up to them."